The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of New Mexico's Cimarron Valley, where a seemingly ordinary ranch hand named James Cooper tended to his daily chores. To the local ranchers and townspeople, he was just another weathered farm worker, but none of them knew his true identity. A decorated FBI agent who had spent 2 decades dismantling drug trafficking operations. When the Los Diablos cartel targeted him for kidnapping, they had no idea they were about to face one of the Bureau's most legendary operatives. The early autumn breeze carried the scent of sage and desert rain across the sprawling Double Cross Ranch, where James had found solace after retiring from the FBI's organized crime division. His calloused hands, once accustomed to handling case files and firearms, now guided the reins of his horse as he rode along the fence line, checking for any damage from the recent storm. The rising sun painted the mountains with strokes of gold and purple, a sight that still took his breath away even after 3 years of calling this place home. At 55, James carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the darkest corners of human nature and emerged stronger. His silver-streaked dark hair and weathered face told the story of countless operations, stakeouts, and undercover missions that had earned him a reputation as one of the Bureau's finest. But those days were behind him now, traded for the simple pleasure of honest work and the peace he'd found in these remote hills. The Double Cross Ranch, owned by the elderly Martinez family, had become more than just a workplace. It was his sanctuary. Maria and Eduardo Martinez had taken him in like family, never questioning his past or why a man with his bearing would choose to work as a ranch hand. They respected his privacy, and in return, he gave them his unwavering loyalty and protection, though they didn't know just how valuable that protection would soon become. As James dismounted near the main barn, his trained eye caught something unusual. Fresh tire tracks cutting through the morning dew, too deep to be from the ranches. Regular pickup trucks. Someone had been watching the property, studying their routines. He'd seen similar surveillance patterns during his time tracking cartel operations, and his instincts, honed through years of experience, told him something was wrong. Inside the barn, James found Maria Martinez sorting through feed bags, her silver hair tied back in a neat braid. She looked up as he entered, her warm smile fading slightly when she noticed his expression. "Everything all right, James?" she asked, setting down the scoop she'd been using. "Just some tracks I don't recognize," he replied, keeping his voice casual, despite the concern gnawing at his gut. "Has anyone unusual been asking about the ranch lately?" Maria hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Some men came by yesterday while you were in town. Said they were interested in buying cattle, but Eduardo didn't like the way they carried themselves. Too clean-cut for ranchers," he said. James felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard rumors at the local diner about cartel activity increasing in the region, but he'd hoped their remote location would keep them off the radar. The Los Diablos cartel had been expanding their territory, using ranches as staging points for their operations. They typically started by approaching owners with business propositions, but those who refused often found themselves facing more aggressive tactics. "Did they leave a card or any contact information?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Maria shook her head, confirming his suspicions. Legitimate buyers always left their details. As he helped Maria finish with the feed, James's mind was already cycling through possible scenarios. His years in the FBI had taught him to stay ahead of threats, to anticipate rather than react. He needed to gather more information without alerting anyone to his concerns. or his true identity. Later that morning, James drove into the small town of Cimarron, population barely over 1,000. The weekly farmers' market was in full swing, providing the perfect cover for what he really needed to do: observe and listen. In small towns like this, information flowed freely over coffee and conversation. At Rosa's diner, he took his usual spot at the counter, ordering black coffee and huevos rancheros from Rosa herself, a chatty woman in her 60s who knew everyone's business. As he ate, he caught fragments of conversations about strange vehicles. In the area, men asking questions about local ranches and rumors of properties changing hands under mysterious circumstances. Sheriff Tom Bradley entered the diner, nodding to James as he passed. They had developed a cautious friendship over the years, though James had never revealed his law enforcement background. The sheriff slid onto the stool next to him, ordering coffee and speaking in low tones. "Might want to keep an eye out, Cooper," Bradley said, stirring sugar into his cup. "Had reports of suspicious activity around some of the outlying ranches. 2 properties sold last month, way below market value. Owners won't talk about it, but word is they were pressured." James absorbed the information, recognizing the pattern. It was a classic cartel expansion strategy. Identify isolated properties, apply pressure through escalating intimidation, and force sales at reduced prices. The ranches would then be used as waypoints for drug trafficking, their remote locations, and legitimate business operations, providing perfect cover. "Any description of the buyers?" James asked, keeping his tone casual while his mind catalogued every detail. Different faces each time, but they all drive high-end black SUVs, usually Escalades or Suburbans. Mexican plates sometimes, but mostly New Mexico or Texas. The sheriff paused, glancing around before continuing. "Had a call from the feds last week. They're tracking increased cartel movement in the region, but you didn't hear that from me." James thanked the sheriff for the warning, paid his bill, and headed to the hardware store. He needed supplies, not just for ranch work, but for what he suspected was coming. As he loaded bags of concrete and coils of barbed wire into his truck, he spotted a black Escalade crawling past, its tinted windows concealing the occupants. The vehicle matched the sheriff's description perfectly. On the drive back to the ranch, James took a longer route than usual, watching his rear-view mirror for signs of surveillance. His FBI training kicked in automatically, varying his speed, making unexpected turns, looking for vehicles that maintained the same pace or appeared at multiple points along his route. He caught glimpses of the same black Escalade twice more, confirming his suspicions that the ranch was being watched. Back at the Double Cross, James found Eduardo Martinez sitting on the porch of the main house, his weathered face creased with worry. The old rancher had built this place from nothing, working the land for over 4 decades. Now in his 70s, he still handled the business side of operations while leaving the physical work to James and a handful of other hands. "Those men came back while you were gone," Eduardo said as James approached. 3 of them this time said they represent some investment group, offered to buy the ranch for cash. When I told them it wasn't for sale, they suggested I might want to reconsider. Said the offer wouldn't stay open forever. James felt his muscles tense, recognizing the implied threat. The cartel was moving faster than he'd anticipated, likely pressured by law enforcement activity to establish new trafficking routes quickly. The Double Cross's location made it an ideal target, close enough to main roads for easy access, but remote enough to avoid casual observation. "Don't worry about them, Mr. Martinez," James assured him, though he knew the situation was grave. "Some people don't understand that not everything's for sale." Eduardo nodded, but James could see the fear in his eyes. The old rancher had worked too hard and too long to lose everything to thugs and criminals. James made a silent vow to protect the ranch and its owners, knowing it would mean drawing on skills he'd hoped to leave in his past. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, James sat in his small cabin on the edge of the ranch property, cleaning his personal firearm, a Glock 19 he'd kept from his FBI days. He hadn't carried it regularly since moving to the ranch, but recent events made him glad he'd maintained his marksmanship at a small range he'd set up behind the cabin. A sudden bark from his German shepherd, Shadow, alerted him to movement outside. James moved silently to the window, staying in the shadows, as he observed three figures attempting to approach the cabin undetected. Their movements were professional, coordinated. These weren't common criminals, but trained operatives, likely cartel enforcers sent to deliver a more direct message. As James watched them advance, his mind was already formulating a plan. He couldn't reveal his FBI background, yet that card needed to be held in reserve. But he could show them that taking the Double Cross Ranch wouldn't be as easy as they thought. The coming confrontation would set in motion events that would draw on every skill he'd learned in 2 decades of law enforcement, testing not just his abilities, but his commitment to protecting the place and people he'd come to call home. Shadows. Low growl continued as the three figures crept closer to James's cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the growing darkness. James remained motionless, his breathing steady as he assessed their approach. They were moving in a standard tactical formation, suggesting military or law enforcement training. Not unusual for cartel enforcers, many of whom were former soldiers or police officers. James silently moved away from the window, retrieving his phone and sending a quick text to Sheriff Bradley. "Unwanted visitors at Double Cross. Might need cleanup later." It was coded language they'd established during their conversations at the diner, a way to alert law enforcement without drawing immediate attention. The sheriff would understand. Stage units nearby, but wait for his signal. The intruders were now within 20 yards of the cabin, their movements becoming more deliberate as they closed in. James could hear their footsteps on the gravel, the subtle crackle of their radio communications. He had 2 choices: confront them directly or let them make the first move. His FBI training had taught him that sometimes the best intelligence came from letting an operation play out within controlled parameters. Shadow's barking suddenly intensified, and James heard one of the men curse in Spanish. The element of surprise was gone, forcing their hand. The front door burst open, wood splintering around the lock as 2 men rushed in, their weapons drawn. The third remained outside, covering potential escape routes. James was ready. He'd positioned himself in the shadows of the kitchen, using the layout he knew by heart to his advantage. The first intruder swept past him, and James moved with the fluid precision of decades of close-quarters combat training. His hand clamped down on the man's weapon, simultaneously driving his knee into the back of the intruder's leg. The man went down hard, his gun clattering across the floor. The second intruder spun toward the sound, but James was already moving. He grabbed a cast-iron pan from the counter and swung it in a wide arc, connecting with the man's forearm. The impact sent the weapon flying, followed by a cry of pain. James drove his elbow into the man's solar plexus, then brought the pan down on the back of his head as he doubled over. The intruder crumpled to the floor unconscious. The first man was scrambling for his weapon, but James's boot came down on his hand, pinning it to the floor. "I wouldn't," James said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of his former profession. The man froze, recognizing the tone of someone used to being obeyed. Outside, Shadow's barking turned to snarls, followed by shouts and cursing. The third man had tried to enter through the back door, only to find himself facing 80 pounds of highly trained German Shepherd. James allowed himself a small smile. Shadow might look like a regular farm dog, but he'd been through the same training as FBI K9 units. "Call off the dog," the man outside yelled, his accent thick with panic. "Shadow, hold," James commanded. The barking ceased, but he could hear the dog's low growl, maintaining pressure on the intruder. "Now, let's have a civilized conversation about why you're here." The two men inside the cabin were quickly secured, with zip ties, another remnant of James's FBI days that he'd kept on hand. The third man was ordered inside at gunpoint, Shadow watching his every move. James surveyed his captives. All three were dressed in tactical gear, their weapons professional grade. This wasn't a simple intimidation attempt. They'd come prepared for serious action. "Your employer should have done better research," James said, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "The double cross isn't for sale, and harassment won't change that. Take that message back to whoever sent you." The leader of the group, the one Shadow had cornered, spoke up. "You don't understand who you're dealing with, ranch hand. Los Diablos don't take no for an answer. This was just a courtesy visit. Next time won't be so friendly." James studied the man's face, memorizing details for future reference. "I understand perfectly who I'm dealing with," he replied. "The question is, do you understand what happens when you threaten the wrong people? This isn't going to end the way your bosses think." He retrieved their weapons and phones, methodically documenting serial numbers and checking recent communications. His FBI instincts kicked in. Every piece of information could be valuable later. The phones would likely be burners, but sometimes cartel operators got sloppy, leaving digital breadcrumbs that could be traced. A distant engine sound caught his attention. Sheriff Bradley arriving with backup. James had chosen his timing carefully, wanting to handle the immediate threat personally, while ensuring law enforcement had evidence of the cartel's escalating tactics. "Your ride's here," James told his captives. "I suggest you cooperate fully with the sheriff. Consider this a warning, the kind you only get once." The sheriff's deputy handled the arrests while Bradley pulled James aside, eyeing the scene with a mixture of surprise and respect. "Want to tell me how one ranch hand took down 3 armed men?" he asked quietly. James shrugged. "Got lucky. They weren't expecting resistance. It wasn't entirely a lie. Overconfidence had been their first mistake." Bradley didn't look convinced, but didn't press further. "We'll hold them on, breaking and entering weapons charges. Might get more if they talk, but cartel soldiers usually don't." "They'll make bail," James said, knowing how these operations worked. "But the message will get back to their bosses. The question is whether they'll take the hint or escalate." After law enforcement left with the prisoners, James did a thorough sweep of the property. The intruders might have left surveillance equipment or markers for future operations. His search revealed 2 small cameras hidden in trees overlooking the main house and barn. Amateur work compared to what he'd seen in his FBI days, but still a concern. He left the cameras in place but adjusted their angles slightly. Let the cartel think they still had eyes on the ranch while actually feeding them useless footage. It was a technique he'd used countless times during undercover operations, using the enemy's surveillance against them. Inside his cabin, James pulled out a burner phone he'd kept for emergencies. It was time to activate some old contacts, people who'd worked with him during his FBI career. He couldn't officially request bureau resources as a retired agent, but there were other ways to gather intelligence and support. The first call went to Mike Ramirez, a former colleague now working private security in Texas. "Mike, it's Cooper. Remember that favor you owe me from the Juarez operation? Time to collect." Ramirez's response was immediate. "Whatever you need, brother. How bad is it?" "Los Diablos are moving into New Mexico ranching territory. Need intel on their current operations, key players. Anything you can get me without compromising your position." Los Diablos. They're expanding fast, getting aggressive. Word is they're under pressure from rival cartels, looking for new territory and trafficking routes. I'll ask around, see what shakes loose. James ended the call and began preparing for what he knew was coming. The cartel wouldn't take tonight's failure lightly. They'd respond with increased force, probably sooner rather than later. He needed to be ready, not just to protect himself, but the entire ranch and the Martinez family. In his bedroom closet behind a false panel, James accessed a secure case containing equipment from his FBI days, surveillance gear, tactical tools, and documentation from past operations against cartels. He'd kept it all, not out of nostalgia, but from the hard-learned lesson that you never know when past resources might become relevant again. Among the items was a satellite phone, untraceable and secure. He'd maintained the service, paying the annual fee without ever really expecting to need it. Now, he was glad he had. There were still people in the Bureau who would want to know about Los Diablos' expansion into new territory, even if they couldn't officially act on information from a retired agent. As he sorted through the equipment, James's mind was already formulating plans. The cartel would have files on everyone associated with the ranch. It was their standard procedure. They'd discover his employment history eventually, but he wanted to control when and how that information came to light. Sometimes the threat of who you might be was more powerful than revealing everything at once. Dawn was breaking by the time James finished his preparations. He'd mapped out defensive positions around the ranch, identified potential vulnerabilities, and started planning countermeasures. The Martinez family would need to be briefed, not on everything, but enough to keep them safe. They deserved to know what they were facing and that they weren't facing it alone. Shadow lay at his feet, alert despite the long night. James reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, grateful for the partnership. "Good boy," he murmured. "We've got work ahead of us." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch, the peaceful scene belying the tension in the air. James watched as Eduardo and Maria emerged from the main house to begin their daily routine, unaware of how close danger had come during the night. He would tell them soon, but first he needed coffee and a moment to think. The cartel had made their first serious move, and he had responded. Now the real game would begin. A contest of wills and strategy between a criminal organization used to taking what they wanted and a man who had spent his life stopping people exactly like them. The peaceful retirement he'd built at the Double. Gross was over, but James felt a familiar energy coursing through him. He'd spent 20 years protecting people from organizations like Los Diablos. He might have left the FBI, but he hadn't lost the skills or the determination that had made him one of their best agents. The morning after the attempted break-in, James sat at the Martinez family's kitchen table, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the air as he carefully explained the situation to Eduardo and Maria. Their faces grew increasingly concerned as he outlined the threat posed by Los Diablos cartel, though he kept the details of his own background vague. "These people, they won't stop, will they?" Maria asked, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. The morning light streaming through the window caught the silver in her hair, making her look more vulnerable than James had ever seen her. "No, they won't stop easily," James replied honestly. "But I have experience dealing with people like this. If you trust me, I can help protect the ranch. However, you need to understand, things might get worse before they get better." Eduardo reached across the table to grasp his wife's hand. "This land, it's not just property to us. It's our life's work, our legacy. We cannot simply give it up to criminals." James nodded, respecting their resolve. "I need you both to follow some new security protocols. No visitors without advance notice. Don't answer questions about the ranch or its operations. And most importantly, if you see anything suspicious, call me immediately." He outlined basic safety measures, drawing on his FBI training to create protocols that would be both effective and manageable for the elderly couple. As he spoke, his burner phone vibrated. A message from Mike Ramirez. With the intelligence he'd requested, the information confirmed his worst fears. Los Diablos wasn't just expanding, they were desperate. Their traditional trafficking routes through Arizona had been compromised by increased border security and rival cartel activity. They needed new pathways into the American heartland, and the remote ranches of northern New Mexico provided perfect cover. After leaving the main house, James drove into town to meet with Sheriff Bradley. The sheriff's office was a modest building on Main Street, its paint peeling in the harsh New Mexico sun. Inside, Bradley was waiting with coffee and a grim expression. "Your visitors from last night aren't talking," Bradley said, as James settled into a chair across from his desk. "But their fingerprints kick back some interesting results. All three have records in Mexico, former military, dishonorable discharges. They're professional muscle." James absorbed the information, adding it to his mental picture of the operation. "They'll make bail soon. Any chance of holding them longer?" Bradley shook his head. "Their lawyer showed up an hour ago. High-priced type from Santa Fe. They'll be out by this afternoon." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, Cooper, I've been doing this job long enough to know when there's more to someone's story. Whatever your background is, I respect your privacy. But if things are going to get ugly, I need to know what I'm dealing with." James considered his options. Having local law enforcement's informed support could be crucial, but revealing too much might complicate things. He decided on a calculated partial truth. "Let's just say, I spent some time working for the federal government," James said carefully. "I've dealt with cartels before. They're moving into this area aggressively, and the double cross won't be there. Last target." Bradley nodded slowly, seeming to accept this limited explanation. "I've got 6 deputies to cover hundreds of square miles. Resources are thin. If things escalate, the best I can offer is quick response when called." "That's all I'm asking for," James replied. "Just keep your eyes open and be ready when I call." Leaving the sheriff's office, James noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted beyond legal limits. The cartel was already watching, tracking his movements. He made a mental note of the vehicle's details while pretending not to notice it. His next stop was the hardware store, where he purchased supplies that could serve multiple purposes. Fertilizer that could be used for explosives, pipes that could become improvised barriers, motion sensors marketed for wildlife detection. The elderly owner, Harry, raised an eyebrow at the unusual combination, but didn't comment. As James loaded the supplies into his truck, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Ramirez. Los Diablos sending heavy hitters. Victor Mendoza leading the operation. Watch your six. The name sent a chill down James's spine. Victor Mendoza had been a person of interest in multiple FBI investigations. A former Mexican Special Forces operator turned cartel enforcer. Known for his tactical expertise and ruthlessness, Mendoza never failed to acquire his targets one way or another. Driving back to the ranch, James took an indirect route, watching for tails. The black SUV from town followed at a distance, not bothering to be subtle about it. They wanted him to know he was being watched, hoping to intimidate him into submission. At the ranch, James began implementing his security plans. He installed the motion sensors at key points around the property, covering likely approach routes. The fertilizer and pipes were stored in the barn, ready to be converted into defensive measures if needed. He showed Eduardo how to use the new security cameras he'd installed, explaining the importance of monitoring the property's perimeter. As evening approached, James received another call, this time from an unlisted number. He answered cautiously, expecting trouble. "James Cooper?" a smooth, accented voice asked. "Or should I say Special Agent Cooper, retired. This is Victor Mendoza. I believe we should talk." James kept his voice neutral, betraying no surprise at being identified. "Nothing to talk about, Mendoza. The ranch isn't for sale." Mendoza chuckled softly. "Always so direct, you FBI types. We know everything about you now, your career, your achievements, the operations you led against our organizations. Very impressive. It makes me wonder why such a distinguished agent is playing cowboy in the middle of nowhere. Maybe I just like the quiet life," James replied, his mind racing. They'd done their homework, but how much did they really know? "The quiet life," Mendoza mused. "Yes, I can understand the appeal, but you've chosen the wrong place for retirement. The double Gross Ranch will serve a greater purpose. The only question is whether the transition will be peaceful or messy." "You've read my file," James said. "Then you know my record against cartels. Walk away, Mendoza. Find another route for your operation." "Ah, but you see, we can't do that." "This is nothing personal, Agent Cooper. Just business. I respect your abilities, which is why I'm giving you this courtesy call. Take the Martinezes and leave. Whatever they're paying you, we'll double it. No one needs to get hurt." James's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not on anyone's payroll, Mendoza. These are good people, and this is their home. Coming after them is personal." "Very well," Mendoza sighed. "Remember, I tried to be reasonable. What happens next is on your conscience." The line went dead. James immediately moved into action. The conversation confirmed his worst fears. Los Diablos wasn't just sending local muscle anymore. They were bringing in their best operators, and they knew exactly who they were dealing with. He retreated to his cabin and pulled out his secure satellite phone. It was time to call in some markers. Within an hour, he had contacted 3 former FBI colleagues who owed him favors. None could officially help, but they could provide intelligence and resources under the table. As night fell, James walked the perimeter of the ranch one last time, shadow at his heel. The property was as secure as he could make it with limited resources, but he knew it wouldn't be enough against what was coming. Mendoza's reputation suggested he would strike hard and fast, probably within the next 48 hours. In the distance, he could see the lights of other ranches dotting the landscape. Some had already fallen to cartel pressure, their owners forced out or coerced into cooperation. The double cross wouldn't share their fate, not while he was there to protect it. Back in his cabin, James reviewed satellite imagery of the area that one of his former colleagues had provided. He marked potential sniper positions, escape routes, and defensive positions. Mendoza would have done the same analysis, looking for weaknesses to exploit. Tomorrow, he would need to have a more detailed conversation with the Martinezes. They needed to understand the full scope of what they were facing and who they had defending them. His FBI background couldn't remain secret any longer. Not if he wanted them to trust his judgment in the coming days. The sound of distant vehicles caught his attention. Through his night vision binoculars, he spotted 3 SUVs moving slowly along the highway that bordered the ranch's western edge. Just surveillance for now, but soon they would make their move. James checked his weapons one last time before trying to get some rest. The past 24 hours had changed everything. His peaceful retirement was over, replaced by the familiar tension of impending conflict. But as he settled into bed, Shadow, alert at the door, he felt a strange sense of readiness. The skills and instincts he'd developed over 2 decades of federal service hadn't faded. They'd just been waiting for a moment like this. Dawn broke over the double-cross ranch with an eerie stillness that James recognized from his FBI days. The calm before the storm. He'd spent the early hours converting the barn into a defensive position, using his years of tactical experience to transform the ordinary structure into a fortified stronghold. Shadow's alert bark drew his attention to movement at the main gate. A sleek black Mercedes was approaching, kicking up dust along the ranch's dirt road. James watched through his binoculars as the vehicle stopped, and a well-dressed man emerged, Victor Mendoza himself, coming to deliver his message in person. James stepped out onto the porch of the main house, where he'd been briefing the Martinez family. His Glock was concealed under his work shirt, and he'd positioned Eduardo and Maria away from windows, with clear instructions to stay out of sight. "Beautiful morning for a visit," Mendoza called out, his polished shoes incongruous against the dusty ground. 2 men flanked him, trying to look casual despite the obvious bulges of concealed weapons under their jackets. "I thought we should continue our conversation face to face, Agent Cooper." "Nothing left to discuss, Mendoza," James replied, maintaining his position on the porch. His eyes scanned the tree line, knowing there would be more cartel members hidden. Probably with rifles trained on his position, Mendoza smiled, spreading his hands in a gesture of false openness. "There's always room for discussion between reasonable men. I've brought a proposal, one that could benefit everyone." He reached into his jacket, slowly producing a manila envelope. "The Martinez family gets a generous retirement package. You receive compensation for your consultation, and we acquire the property legally. No violence, no mess, just business." James didn't move to take the envelope. "You're wasting your time. The answer's still no." Mendoza's smile remained, but his eyes hardened. "You know, I researched some of your old cases. The Juarez operation in 15, the Sinaloa bust in 18. Impressive work, but you're not FBI anymore, Cooper. You're one man, alone, against an organization with unlimited resources." "Am I?" James asked. letting a hint of challenge enter his voice. "You've done your homework, Mendoza. You know my record. Do you really think I came out here without a contingency plan?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mendoza's face. "You have no official standing anymore. No backup, no resources. The local sheriff can barely patrol his jurisdiction. Who exactly do you think is coming to help?" James allowed himself a small smile. "You're assuming a lot about what connections I maintained after retirement. Are you sure you want to gamble your operation on those assumptions?" The implied threat hung in the air. James knew that cartels operated on certainty. They needed to know exactly what they were facing. Uncertainty made them cautious, and right now, Mendoza couldn't be sure what kind of network a decorated former FBI agent might have maintained. "Consider carefully what happens next," Mendoza said, his voice losing its friendly veneer. "You've seen how cartels deal with obstacles. The Martinez family doesn't need to suffer for your stubbornness." James took a step forward, his demeanor shifting subtly. Gone was the ranch hand's casual stance, replaced by the focused intensity of a federal agent. "And you should consider what happens when you threaten people under my protection. Check your files again, Mendoza. How many cartel operations did I shut down? How many of your colleagues are sitting in federal prison because of my work?" Mendoza's men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but their boss held up a hand to stop them. He studied James for a long moment, reassessing the situation. "You have 24 hours, Mendoza finally said, dropping the envelope on the ground. "After that, whatever happens is your responsibility." He turned and walked back to his car, his men following reluctantly. As the Mercedes disappeared in a cloud of dust, James retrieved the envelope. Inside was paperwork for the sale of the ranch, along with photographs, surveillance shots of Eduardo and Maria in town, at church, shopping. The message was clear. The cartel could reach them anywhere. Inside the house, James found Eduardo and Maria waiting anxiously. "That was him, wasn't it?" Eduardo asked. "The one you warned us about." James nodded, showing them the envelope's contents. "They're trying to pressure you through legal channels first. It's their standard approach. Make everything look legitimate on paper." Maria's hands trembled as she looked at the photos. "They've been watching us all this time." "I won't let them hurt you," James assured them. "But we need to move quickly. I have a safe house prepared, somewhere they can't find you." Eduardo shook his head firmly. "This is our home. We will not be driven away by thugs and criminals." "Eduardo," James said gently, "I need you to trust me on this. It's not about running away. It's about giving me the freedom to deal with them, without worrying about your safety." After some discussion, the Martinezes agreed to relocate temporarily. James had already arranged for them to stay with a former FBI colleague who owned a small bed and breakfast in Colorado. Within an hour, they were packed and ready to leave. As James helped load their car, his satellite phone buzzed with a message from one of his contacts. "Cartel moving heavy weapons across border. ETA 18 hours. Multiple vehicles. Professional. Crew." The timeline was accelerating. Mendoza had given him 24 hours, but the cartel was already mobilizing. They weren't taking any chances with the former federal agent. They were bringing in serious firepower. Once the Martinezes were safely on their way, James began implementing the next phase of his plan. He'd spent years studying cartel tactics, knowing how they thought and operated. Now he would use that knowledge against them. The barn had already been fortified, but that was just the beginning. James began setting up a series of defensive positions across the ranch, each designed to channel attackers into predetermined zones. He'd learned from his FBI days that the key to surviving against superior numbers was to control the battlefield. Using the supplies he'd gathered, James created improvised barriers and booby traps. Nothing lethal. He wasn't looking to kill anyone if he could avoid it, but enough to disrupt and disorient an attacking force. Motion sensors were carefully hidden along likely approach routes, their signals feeding back to a tablet he kept with him. By late afternoon, James had transformed the ranch into a tactical nightmare for any attacking force. The seemingly open terrain was now a carefully orchestrated maze of obstacles and choke points. Even the cattle had been moved to the far pastures, preventing the cartel from using them as cover or causing chaos during a firefight. Shadow stayed close, the dogs, training making him an invaluable partner. James had equipped him with a tactical vest, another remnant from his FBI days. Knowing the German Shepherd's capabilities could be the difference between life and death in the coming conflict. As sunset approached, James received another message, this time from Sheriff Bradley. Multiple vehicles spotted on back roads. Heavy guys, professional equipment. They're staging somewhere close. The cartel was positioning their forces, probably waiting for darkness to begin their operation. James used the remaining daylight to make final preparations, checking weapons and communications equipment. He'd set up multiple fallback positions throughout the property, each stocked with essential supplies. In his cabin, James opened the hidden compartment containing his FBI tactical gear. He hadn't worn the body armor or combat webbing in years, but as he strapped it on, the familiar weight was almost comforting. This wasn't how he'd planned to spend his retirement, but in some ways, it felt like coming home. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges. James positioned himself in the barn's upper level, where he had clear lines of sight across most of the property. Through his night vision scope, he could see heat signatures moving. In the distant tree line, cartel soldiers getting into position. Shadow lay quietly beside him, ears forward, sensing the tension in the air. James checked his weapons one final time and settled in to wait. The next few hours would determine everything. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had something. The cartel didn't. Intimate knowledge of both the terrain and their tactics. Mendoza had given him 24 hours, but James knew the attack would come much sooner. The cartel enforcer had merely been following protocol with the warning. His forces were probably already in position when he delivered it. Now it was just a matter of time before they made their move. The first sign of the cartel's attack came just after midnight. James's motion sensors lit up in sequence as multiple teams breached the ranch's perimeter. Through his night vision scope, he counted at least 15 heavily armed men moving in tactical formation across the property. They were good, professional operators who knew how to move under cover of darkness. Shadow's ears perked up, but the dog remained silent, trained to wait for commands. James watched as the cartel forces split into 3 teams, approaching from different angles. Their formation was textbook, designed to cut off any escape routes while maintaining overlapping fields of fire. The tablet beside him showed more heat signatures in the tree line, a reserve force waiting to provide support. Mendoza wasn't taking any chances. James estimated they had close to 30 men total, armed with military-grade weapons and equipment. "Let's make them work for it, boy," James whispered to Shadow, activating the first set of defensive measures. the ranch's automated sprinkler system suddenly burst to life, spraying the approaching teams with water mixed with fertilizer. The chemical combination would interfere with their night vision equipment, forcing them to rely on natural sight in the darkness. Confusion rippled through the cartel ranks as their expensive thermal imaging gear became temporarily useless. James used the disruption to move to his second position, Shadow following silently. Years of FBI tactical training had taught him the importance of mobility. Stay still too long, and you become an easy target. The cartel's lead team reached the first line of barriers James had erected. He'd used hay bales reinforced with scrap metal, creating cover that looked natural but could stop bullets. The team's point man signaled for them to move around, exactly as James had anticipated. As they changed course, the first real trap was triggered. A series of flashbang grenades detonated in sequence, their combination of bright light and deafening sound devastating in the darkness. 3 cartel operators went down immediately, disoriented and clutching their ears. Radio chatter erupted as the teams tried to coordinate their response. James picked up fragments of Spanish through his surveillance equipment. They were calling for night vision goggles from the reserve force, not realizing the sprinkler system had rendered them nearly useless. A single shot rang out from the tree line, a sniper trying to pinpoint his position. The round impacted harmlessly against the barn's reinforced wall, several feet from where James had been moments before. He'd already relocated, using the building's modified interior to move quietly between firing positions. "First team, push forward," a voice commanded over the radio, Mendoza coordinating the assault from somewhere nearby. "Second team, circle east. Third team, maintain position and provide cover fire." James keyed his own radio, sending a pre-arranged signal to Sheriff Bradley. The local law enforcement wouldn't engage directly, but they would establish a perimeter around the ranch, preventing any cartel reinforcements from arriving. The first team advanced cautiously toward the barn, using standard cover and movement techniques. James waited until they were halfway across the open ground before triggering his next surprise. The ground beneath their feet suddenly gave way, a carefully prepared pit covered with lightweight material that looked solid but couldn't support their weight. 2 men fell into the shallow trench, not deep enough to injure, but sufficient to disrupt their formation. The others scattered for cover, firing blindly at the barn. James responded with carefully aimed shots, targeting extremities rather than center mass. He wasn't trying to kill them. Wounded men would require others to help them, reducing the cartel's effective fighting force. Shadow growled softly, alerting James to movement on their flank. The second team had reached the eastern edge of the barn, preparing to breach. He activated another set of flashbangs combined with smoke grenades to further deteriorate their visibility. "They're toying with us," one of the cartel operators shouted in Spanish. "He's alone. Push through it." James smiled grimly. Their frustration was making them sloppy. The team attempting to breach the barn's side door didn't notice the thin wire at ankle height. As they rushed forward, the trap activated, releasing a cascade of agricultural lime. The caustic powder burned their eyes and throats, sending them staggering backward in disarray. A new voice crackled over the radio. Mendoza himself, no longer content to observe from a distance. "Enough games. Bring up the heavy weapons. We'll burn him out if we have to." The sound of vehicles approaching confirmed James's fears. The cartel was escalating, bringing in mounted weapons. Through his scope, he spotted a truck with a mounted .50 caliber machine gun, enough firepower to tear through even his reinforced walls. Time to change tactics. James triggered the charges he'd placed around the barn's perimeter. Not explosives, but containers of pressurized water and farm chemicals. The resulting clouds of fertilizer-laden mist reduced visibility to near zero while making the ground treacherously slippery. "Shadow, go," James commanded softly. The German Shepherd moved silently through a concealed exit, trained to create a distraction at a specific location. Moments later, barking and shouts erupted from the tree line where the cartel's reserve force was stationed. James used the confusion to relocate to the ranch house. He'd prepared multiple fighting positions, and the barn had served its purpose in drawing their initial assault. The cartel forces were now spread out, their coordinated attack plan disrupted by the series of obstacles and distractions. The mounted machine gun opened fire, tearing through the barn's upper level where James had been positioned minutes before. The cartel operators cheered, thinking they had him pinned down, not realizing they were shredding an empty position. "Check the house," Mendoza ordered, his voice tight with frustration. "He's too good to stay in one place. Watch for more traps." James activated the ranch house's defensive measures. Every window was rigged with steel shutters that slammed shut at the push of a button, while strategically placed spotlights suddenly illuminated the surrounding area, destroying the attackers' night vision advantage. The cartel forces found themselves caught in the open, exposed by the harsh lighting while their target remained concealed. James used their moment of confusion to pick off the machine gunner with a carefully aimed shot to the shoulder. The heavy weapon fell silent as its operator slumped over. "Pull back and regroup," Mendoza commanded. "He's turning our tactics against us. Reset and approach from all sides simultaneously." As the cartel forces retreated to the tree line, James checked his ammunition and resources. The first wave of the assault had been repelled, but he knew Mendoza wouldn't give up easily. The cartel enforcer's reputation was built on never failing. A mission, and he had too many resources to simply withdraw. Shadow returned silently through a hidden entrance, his tactical vest showing no signs of damage. The dog had successfully created chaos among the reserve force, probably injuring a few in the process. James praised him quietly while watching the cartel teams reorganize through his thermal scope. The next phase would be more difficult. Mendoza would adapt his tactics, possibly calling in more reinforcements. The cartel enforcer wouldn't risk his reputation by failing to take one ranch, no matter how well defended it was. James used the brief respite to send another coded message to Sheriff Bradley, updating him on the situation. He also checked the satellite phone. No messages from his FBI contacts yet, but he knew they would be monitoring cartel communications, gathering intelligence on Los Diablos' operations. The sound of helicopters in the distance caught his attention. The cartel was bringing in air support, probably with thermal imaging equipment that could overcome his ground-based countermeasures. James smiled grimly. He had prepared for this possibility too. As he moved to implement the next phase of his defense, James reflected on the irony of the situation. He had come to the Double Cross Ranch seeking peace and quiet, a place to retire from the high-stakes world of federal law enforcement. Instead, he had found himself in exactly the kind of conflict he'd spent his career fighting. But this time was different. This wasn't just another operation. It was personal. The Martinez family had given him a home, treated him like family when he needed it most. He would defend their ranch with every skill and trick he'd learned. In 20 years of fighting cartels, no matter what Mendoza threw at him next, the helicopter's searchlights swept across the ranch property, casting harsh shadows that danced across the battlefield. James watched from his position in the ranch house as two military-style Bell helicopters circled overhead, their thermal imaging equipment scanning for his heat signature. Mendoza's voice crackled over the intercepted radio channel. "We have eyes in the sky now. Nowhere left to hide, Cooper. Make it easy on yourself." James activated the ranch's irrigation system at full power, creating a fine mist that would interfere with the thermal imaging. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would blur their readings. Enough to make targeting difficult. The water would also help control any fires if they decided to use incendiary weapons. Shadow pressed against his leg, alerting him to movement on the ground. Through his scope, James spotted cartel operators advancing under the helicopter's cover, using the searchlight's shadows to mask their approach. They had adapted quickly, learning from their earlier mistakes. Multiple teams converging, James muttered to himself, counting at least 20 men in the new assault wave. They had changed their equipment too. Heavier body armor, ballistic shields, equipment designed for a prolonged siege. The first team reached the outer defensive perimeter, moving more cautiously this time. They probed for traps, using their shields to protect their advance. James let them progress, waiting for the right moment to spring his next surprise. A burst of gunfire from the tree line forced James to duck behind cover. They were using the helicopters to pin him down while their ground forces advanced. It was a solid strategy, one he'd used himself during FBI operations. "Shadow Defense Protocol 3, James commanded. The German Shepherd slipped away through a hidden passage while James activated the next phase of his defensive plan. Underground sprinklers burst to life, but instead of water, they sprayed a mixture of agricultural chemicals and diesel fuel. The combination created a slick, disorienting surface that would make any advance treacherous. The cartel teams stumbled, their coordinated movement disrupted by the suddenly hazardous terrain. James used their moment of confusion to target their communication equipment. Precise shots disabling radio antennas and headsets. From somewhere in the darkness, Shadow began his assigned task. The dog's barking created the illusion of multiple defenders moving through the property, drawing fire and attention away from James's actual position. "The dog is a distraction," Mendoza shouted over the radio. "Focus on the house. Use the tear gas. Flush him out." Canisters of tear gas arced through the air, smoke billowing as they landed. But James had prepared for this too. The ranch house's ventilation system, modified from his FBI tactical training, kicked in automatically, creating positive pressure that kept the gas at bay. The helicopters tightened their circle, their noise deafening as they tried to coordinate with the ground teams. James knew they would be carrying their own thermal imaging equipment, more sophisticated than the ground unit's gear. Time to deal with the air threat. James retrieved a specialized laser pointer from his tactical gear. Not powerful enough to damage the helicopters, but sufficient to temporarily blind their optical sensors and make precise targeting impossible. The first helicopter veered away as the laser struck its camera system, its searchlights swinging wildly. The second pilot, more cautious, maintained distance while trying to coordinate with ground forces. "He's got countermeasures for everything," one of the cartel operators yelled in frustration. "This isn't a ranch hand. He's got professional training." Mendoza's response was cold and calculated. Of course he does, he's former FBI, but even federal agents can't hold out forever. Bring up the armored vehicles. The ground shook as 3 armored SUVs approached, their reinforced frames capable of withstanding small arms fire. They formed a triangle around the ranch house, mounted lights illuminating every angle. James checked his ammunition. He had prepared for vehicles, but taking out armored SUVs would require perfect shots or larger weapons than he currently had available. Time to change tactics again. He triggered charges planted along the ranch's access roads, not explosives, but devices that spread caltrops and other tire-shredding materials. The SUVs' run-flat tires would survive, but their mobility would be severely limited. Breach the house, Mendoza ordered. All teams, simultaneous entry. He can't watch every entrance at once. The assault teams moved forward behind their ballistic shields, approaching from multiple angles. They had learned from their earlier casualties, staying tight and coordinated despite the hazardous ground conditions. James moved quickly through the house's secret passages, maintenance corridors, and spaces he had modified for exactly this scenario. The ranch house's layout was now a maze designed to separate and isolate attacking forces. The first breach came at the back door, shaped charges destroying the reinforced lock. Cartel operators poured in, only to find themselves in a carefully designed kill house. Every angle was covered, every corner a potential ambush point. James engaged them methodically, using his knowledge of the layout to stay one step ahead. Non-lethal shots disabled weapons and equipment, while strategically placed barriers forced them to bunch up in pre-sighted locations. Shadow's barking suddenly changed tone, the signal they had practiced indicating flanking movement. James switched positions just as bullets tore through the wall where he had been standing. The cartel had breached the second entrance. "He's moving through the walls," someone shouted. "There are passages we can't see." Mendoza's voice cut through the chaos. "Plant charges on the structural walls. If he wants to play in the maze, we'll bring it down around him." James knew it was time to abandon the house. He had prepared for this, knowing the cartel would eventually resort to destroying the building. He triggered smoke grenades throughout the structure, using the cover to move toward his escape route. The helicopters spotted movement as he emerged from a concealed basement exit, their searchlights swinging to illuminate his position. James fired the laser pointer again, buying precious seconds as he sprinted toward the barn. "There, by the barn!" Multiple voices shouted, gunfire erupting from several directions. James dove through the barn's hidden entrance, Shadow appearing silently beside him as he sealed the reinforced door. Inside the barn, James activated his backup systems. The structure had been prepared as a fallback position, with its own power supply and defensive measures. Through security cameras, he watched. The cartel forces surround the building. "Cooper!" Mendoza's voice boomed through a megaphone. "The house is wired to blow. Surrender now, or we level it, and the barn with you inside." James checked his watch. The prolonged engagement had achieved its primary purpose, giving Sheriff Bradley time to coordinate with state police and establish a cordon around the area. No additional cartel forces would be able to join the fight, but Mendoza still had enough men and firepower to make good on his threat. The cartel enforcer's reputation was on the line, and he would risk everything to complete his mission. James reached for his satellite phone, checking for messages from his FBI contacts. The intelligence they had gathered during this operation would be valuable, but right now he needed more immediate support. Shadow's ears perked up, detecting movement above them. The cartel was positioning men on the barn's roof, likely preparing to breach from multiple points. The next phase of the battle would be even more intense than the first. James settled into his defensive position, checking his weapons one last time. He had hurt them, disrupted their operation, and damaged their reputation. But now came the hard part, surviving their full fury while ensuring the evidence of their operation reached the right authorities. The sound of helicopters grew louder as they positioned themselves around the barn. Mendoza was preparing for a final, overwhelming assault. The real battle was about to begin. The mounted miniguns opened fire, their distinctive sound filling the air as thousands of rounds per minute tore into the barn's reinforced structure. James stayed low, counting seconds as the barrage continued. The cartel had positioned their heavy weapons to create overlapping fields of fire, leaving no angle uncovered. "Maintain suppressing fire," Mendoza ordered through the command channel. "Breach teams, prepare to move in 3 minutes. He's either dead or pinned down. This ends now." Through the barn's surveillance system, James watched as demolition teams moved into position, carrying enough explosives to reduce the structure to rubble. They were done trying to capture him. Now they just wanted to eliminate the threat. He represented, shadow pressed against his leg, waiting for commands. The dog's training and instincts had proven invaluable throughout the night, but now came the most crucial part of their strategy. 10 minutes to contingency, the satellite phone displayed. James allowed himself a grim smile. Everything was proceeding according to plan, though the next few minutes would push his skills to their absolute limit. The minigun fire suddenly ceased, replaced by an eerie silence. James could hear the breach teams moving into position, their boots crunching on the debris-strewn ground. "All teams in position," a voice reported. "Demolition charges ready." Mendoza's response was immediate. "Execute breach on my mark. Remember, we want confirmation, no assumptions." James activated his final defensive measures. The barn's entire electrical system had been rigged for this moment, creating a cascade of failures that would appear random but were carefully orchestrated. The first explosions hit the barn's outer walls, precisely placed charges designed to collapse the structure. But James had prepared for this, reinforcing crucial support points while leaving others seemingly strong but actually vulnerable. As the dust billowed, cartel operators poured in through the breach points, expecting to find their target either dead or severely wounded. Instead, they encountered a maze of collapsed beams and barriers that channeled them into pre-sighted killing zones. "Something's wrong," one of the operators called out. "The structure's collapsing differently than expected. Watch for..." His warning was cut short as James triggered his counterattack. Modified sprinkler systems released a combination of agricultural chemicals that created a dense, caustic fog. The cartel's night vision and thermal imaging equipment became worse than useless, actively disorienting their users. Shadow moved silently through the chaos, his bark echoing from different locations, making it impossible for the attackers to determine the source. The dog's distraction allowed James to engage multiple targets, using his intimate knowledge of the barn's modified layout to stay one step ahead. "Pull back!" someone shouted in Spanish. "He's turning the building into a trap." But retreat wasn't simple. The initial breaching charges had destabilized parts of the structure according to James's plan, making some routes impassable while forcing the cartel operators to bunch up in predictable locations. The helicopters attempted to provide support, but the chemical fog and confusing layout made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Their powerful searchlights only succeeded in creating more disorientation as they reflected off the dense clouds. 5 minutes to contingency. The satellite phone updated. James began moving toward his final position, triggering a series of controlled collapses behind him that further separated and isolated the cartel teams. Mendoza's voice crackled with fury over the radio. "Everyone still inside! Get out now! Prepare the heavy explosives! We're bringing it all down!" The cartel forces began a chaotic retreat, hampered by the very obstacles they had created with their breach charges. James used their confusion to collect critical intelligence, identifying key operators and equipment that his FBI contacts would need to track. Shadow's warning bark alerted him to movement above. A team had managed to reach the upper level and was attempting to set up a sniper position. James triggered one last chemical release, this time adding a component that would render their optical scopes useless. 2 minutes, the phone displayed. James made final adjustments to his position, ensuring all surveillance equipment was still transmitting. The evidence gathered tonight would be crucial in dismantling Los Diablos operations across multiple states. Through his thermal scope, he watched Mendoza coordinating the final assault. The cartel enforcer had moved closer, directing the placement of enough explosives to level a city block. They were done with precision. Now they just wanted destruction. "All teams clear the blast radius," Mendoza ordered. "Prepare for final..." His command was interrupted by a new sound. The distinctive thrum of military helicopters approaching from multiple directions. Not the cartel's civilian aircraft, but heavy combat units moving with professional precision. "Multiple bogies incoming," one of the cartel pilots shouted. "Military-grade, heavily armed." James checked his phone one last time. "Contingency executed. Hold position." The night sky suddenly blazed with light as multiple helicopters emerged. From the darkness, their powerful spotlights illuminating the entire property. The aircraft bore no markings, but their tactical approach made their identity clear. This was the FBI's elite hostage rescue team, supported by elements from other federal agencies. Mendoza's reaction was immediate. "All units, scatter, abort. Mission, make for secondary rally points." But retreat wasn't an option. The federal response had been carefully coordinated, using the intelligence James had gathered throughout the night. Every escape route was already covered, every fallback position compromised. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation," a voice boomed across the property. "You are surrounded by federal agents and tactical units. Surrender immediately." The cartel forces began to fragment, their coordinated assault dissolving into individual attempts at escape. Some threw down their weapons immediately, while others tried to fight back, only to face overwhelming and precisely directed force. James maintained his position, using his surveillance system to feed real-time intelligence to the HRT operators. Each piece of information helped them isolate and neutralize threats with minimal casualties. Shadow stayed alert at his side, the dog's training allowing him to distinguish between the chaos of battle and genuine threats. His occasional warning. Growls helped James track movements that even the thermal sensors missed. Through his scope, James spotted Mendoza making a final desperate move. The cartel enforcer had reached his command vehicle and was attempting to remotely trigger the demolition charges still planted around the barn. "Not happening," James muttered, sending a specific set of coordinates to the HRT command unit. seconds. Later, precise fire from one of the helicopters disabled Mendoza's vehicle, trapping him in place. The battle was effectively over. Federal agents moved methodically across the property, securing suspects and gathering evidence. The surveillance footage James had collected would provide crucial intelligence about Los Diablos' operations, leading to arrests and seizures across multiple states. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the battlefield, James finally allowed himself to relax slightly. The barn had held, though its walls bore the scars of intense combat. More importantly, the Martinez family's ranch was safe, and a major cartel expansion had been stopped in its tracks. A familiar voice crackled over his satellite phone. "Clear to exit, Cooper. Welcome back to the game." James patted Shadow's head as he prepared to emerge from his position. The peaceful retirement he'd sought might be over, but he had been reminded of something important. Sometimes the skills you try to leave behind are exactly what's needed to protect the things that matter most. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Double Cross Ranch as federal agents secured the scene. James emerged from the barn with Shadow at his heel, surveying the aftermath of the night's battle. The property bore the scars of intense combat. Shell casings littered the ground, impact craters marked the walls, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air. FBI tactical teams moved efficiently across the battlefield, processing evidence and securing detained cartel members. Among them, James recognized several faces from his active duty days, veterans of joint operations against drug trafficking organizations. Special Agent Sarah Collins, the HRT team leader, approached him with a mix of respect and amusement in her expression. "Still can't stay retired, can you, Cooper?" she asked, holstering her weapon. "Retirement got a little too exciting," James replied, watching as agents led a handcuffed Mendoza toward an awaiting transport vehicle. The cartel enforcer's face was a mask of fury and disbelief, his reputation shattered by the night's events. Sarah gestured toward the barn's battle-scarred exterior. "Your intel was perfect. The surveillance footage you transmitted gave us everything we needed to coordinate the response. Los Diablos' entire northern expansion operation is compromised. More vehicles arrived, including a mobile command center that would serve as the base for processing the scene. Evidence response teams began documenting everything, from the sophisticated weapons the cartel had deployed to the defensive measures James had improvised." "The Martinez family?" James asked, though he already knew they were safe. His FBI contacts had confirmed their arrival at the safe house hours ago. "Secure and protected," Sarah assured him. "We've got teams at their location, and they'll be able to return once we've processed the scene. They're lucky to have had you here." Shadow's ears perked up as Sheriff Bradley's patrol car approached. The local law enforcement officer stepped out, taking in the scale of the federal operation with wide eyes. His small department had played a crucial role, maintaining a perimeter that prevented cartel reinforcements from arriving. "Quite a night." "Cooper," Bradley said, extending his hand. "Could have mentioned you were FBI when you first came to town. Would have saved me some sleepless nights wondering about your background." James shook the offered hand. "Wasn't FBI then. Just a retired agent looking for peace and quiet. Things got complicated." "They usually do," Sarah interjected. "But your response bought us the time we needed to mount this operation. The intelligence we gathered tonight will help shut down cartel operations across 3 states." A medical team was treating the wounded, both federal agents and cartel members. James had been selective in his targeting, focusing on disabling rather than killing when possible. It was an approach he'd learned during his FBI career. Dead suspects couldn't provide intelligence. One of the evidence teams called Sarah over to examine something they'd found in Mendoza's command vehicle. James used the moment to walk the property, assessing damage and beginning to plan repairs. The ranch would need significant work to restore it to its former state. "Cooper!" Sarah called out, waving him over. "You need to see this!" In Mendoza's vehicle, they had discovered detailed files on multiple ranches in the region, properties the cartel had targeted for acquisition. The double cross had been just one part of a larger operation aimed at establishing a network of trafficking routes through northern New Mexico. They had plans for the entire region, Sarah explained, spreading out maps marked with potential targets. Your stand here didn't just save one ranch, it exposed their whole expansion strategy. The implications were significant. Los Diablos had invested heavily in this operation, committing resources and personnel that would now be vulnerable to federal investigation. The cartel's entire northern corridor was compromised. James studied the documents, recognizing names of neighboring ranches and families he'd come to know during his time at the Double Cross. Some had already been approached by cartel representatives, facing the same pressure tactics that had targeted the Martinez family. "We'll need to establish a task force," Sarah continued. "These files give us probable cause for multiple warrants. Would you consider coming back in a consulting capacity? Your experience with both the cartel and the local community would be invaluable." The question gave James pause. He had left the bureau seeking a simpler life, tired of the constant tension and sacrifice that came with federal service. But the night's events had reminded him of something important. Sometimes the skills you try to leave behind are exactly what's needed to protect the things you care about. "Let me think about it," he replied, watching as more evidence teams arrived. The sun was fully up now, revealing the true extent of the battle damage. The barn's reinforced walls had held, but the structure would need significant repairs. Shadow suddenly tensed, his training alerting him to approaching vehicles. A convoy of FBI transport units arrived, ready to move the detained cartel members to secure facilities for processing and interrogation. Mendoza, still in handcuffs, caught James's eye as he was led toward one of the transports. "This isn't over. Cooper," he called out, "Los Diablos doesn't forget." "It's over for you," James responded calmly. "Your operational plans are compromised, your networks exposed. The cartel won't risk good money chasing bad. You know how they operate." The cartel enforcer's face twisted with fury, but federal agents quickly moved him into the transport vehicle. James knew Mendoza was right about one thing. Los Diablos wouldn't forget this defeat easily, but their immediate threat to the region was neutralized. Sarah approached again, this time with a satellite phone. "Call from the Martinez family. They're worried about the ranch and want to know when they can return." James took the phone, stepping away to speak privately with Eduardo and Maria. Their relief at hearing his voice was palpable, and he assured them that their property was secure. The damage was significant but repairable. What mattered was that their home had been protected. As federal teams continued processing the scene, James began making mental notes of immediate repairs needed to make the ranch operational again. The barn would need structural work, fences had to be rebuilt, and the fields would require attention after being torn up by vehicles and explosions. Sheriff Bradley joined him in surveying the damage. Town's already buzzing with rumors about what happened here last night. Gonna be hard to keep this quiet. Maybe it shouldn't be kept quiet, James suggested. The cartel thrived on secrecy and intimidation. Exposing their operations might be the best protection for other ranches they've targeted. Sarah overheard the conversation and nodded in agreement. We're already preparing a public briefing. Obviously, we'll protect sensitive details, but the community needs to know they're not alone in facing these threats. The morning progressed as more federal resources arrived. Evidence teams documented everything meticulously, building a case that would support multiple prosecutions. The cartel's sophisticated weapons and equipment were catalogued and secured, while tactical teams swept the property for any remaining threats. James found himself repeatedly answering questions from various agents, providing details about the night's events and the intelligence he had gathered during his time at the ranch. His experience in both law enforcement and local ranching operations provided crucial context for the investigation. Shadow remained vigilant throughout the process, his training and instincts still engaged despite the immediate threat being over. The dog had proven invaluable during the night's combat, and several tactical team members commented on his performance. As the morning wore on, James's satellite phone buzzed with another message. This time from Mike Ramirez, his former FBI colleague who had provided initial intelligence about Los Diablos' operations. Heard you had an exciting night, the message read. Cartel networks are in chaos. Los Diablos pulling back from multiple operations. You stirred up quite a hornet's nest. Looking across the ranch property, James allowed himself a moment to reflect on how much had changed in 24 hours. The peaceful retirement he had sought might be over, but he had protected something important. Not just the Martinez family's ranch, but an entire community threatened by cartel expansion. The sun climbed higher in the New Mexico sky as federal operations continued. The battle was over, but its implications would ripple through both law enforcement and cartel organizations for months to come. For James Cooper, former FBI agent turned ranch hand, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would combine his past expertise with his commitment to protecting his adopted home. 3 days after the battle at Double Cross Ranch, James stood with Eduardo and Maria Martinez as they returned to their property. The FBI's evidence teams had finally cleared the scene, leaving behind a landscape marked by the intensity of the conflict, but ready for rebuilding. It looks different, Maria whispered, her hand gripping her husband's arm as they surveyed the damage. The barn's walls bore the scars of heavy weapons fire, and the once pristine fields were rutted by vehicle tracks and explosive impacts. We'll rebuild it all, James assured them, Shadow alert at his side. The structure is sound. Everything else is just surface damage that can be repaired. Eduardo nodded slowly, his weathered face showing both concern and determination. The ranch has survived drought, floods, and economic hardships. It will survive this too, but things will be different now, won't they? James couldn't deny it. The quiet anonymity he had sought in coming to the Double Cross was gone. The community knew now about his FBI background, and word of the battle had spread through the region's ranching families. Sarah Collins arrived in an FBI vehicle carrying files and maps from the ongoing investigation. The Martinez family's return has been logged, she reported professionally. We'll maintain surveillance of the property for the next few weeks, just as a precaution. The task force she had proposed was already operational, using intelligence gathered during the battle to track Los Diablos' remaining assets in the region. Multiple ranches had come forward with reports of cartel intimidation, building a comprehensive picture of the organization's attempted expansion. The repair crews will arrive tomorrow, Sarah continued, handing James a document. The Bureau's Victim Assistance Program is covering the costs. Consider it compensation for your help in breaking open this case. James reviewed the paperwork while Maria and Eduardo walked the property, making notes of immediate repairs needed to resume normal operations. The ranch had been their life's work, and seeing it damaged had hit them hard. Sheriff Bradley's patrol car pulled up, the local lawman bringing updates from town. The community's response to recent events had surprised everyone. Instead of fear, the exposure of cartel activities had sparked determination. Ranchers are organizing meetings, Bradley reported, sharing information, setting up communication networks. Nobody wants to be vulnerable to these threats again. James nodded, understanding the significance. The cartel's power had always relied partly on isolation, targeting properties and families they thought would be too afraid or too alone to resist. That advantage was now gone. Sarah spread maps across the hood of her vehicle, showing the broader impact of their operation. Los Diablos is pulling back across the region. The exposure of their expansion plans has disrupted multiple operations. Your stand here did more than save one ranch. The satellite phone in James's pocket buzzed. Another update from his FBI. Contacts tracking cartel movements. Los Diablos' leadership was in turmoil, facing both law enforcement pressure and questions from their own organization about the failed operation. Mendoza's interrogation is yielding results, Sarah added quietly. He's facing multiple federal charges, and his loyalty to the cartel seems to be wavering. He knows too much to expect protection from them. The mention of Mendoza brought back memories of the intense battle, but James pushed them aside. The immediate threat was over. Now it was time to focus on rebuilding and preventing similar situations in the future. Maria called out from the barn, where she was assessing damage to their stored equipment. James excused himself and walked over, Shadow following attentively. The dog had become a symbol of security for the Martinez family, his presence helping them feel safe returning home. Inside the barn, James helped Maria inventory the supplies that had survived the battle. Many of his defensive modifications could be repurposed for legitimate security measures, protecting the ranch without turning it into a fortress. The other ranchers want to meet with you, Maria said as they worked. They're calling you a hero, you know, the man who stood up to the cartel. James shook his head. No heroes here, just people protecting what matters to them. The real strength will come from the community working together, not relying on one person. But he understood the sentiment. His stand at the double cross had shown others that resistance was possible, that the cartels weren't invincible. It was a message that would resonate through the ranching community. Sarah approached with more paperwork, forms requesting his assistance as a consultant on the task force. We need someone who understands both sides, she explained. Law enforcement and ranching operations. There's no one better qualified. The offer represented a middle ground between his old life and new one. He could contribute his expertise without returning to full federal service, helping protect the community while maintaining his connection to the ranch. Eduardo joined them, carrying building materials salvaged from the damaged sections of the barn. Whatever you decide, you'll always have a place here, the old rancher said firmly. You're family now, not just an employee. The words carried special weight coming from Eduardo, who had built the double cross from nothing and protected it through decades of challenges. His acceptance meant more than any official recognition. Sheriff Bradley's radio crackled with reports of suspicious vehicles near other ranches in the region. The cartel's main force was gone, but their scouts still tested defenses, looking for weaknesses or opportunities. "They're like wolves," Bradley commented. "Always probing, always watching, but now we're watching too, and we're not alone anymore." James studied the security plan Sarah had brought, suggesting modifications based on his experience. The FBI's resources, combined with local knowledge and cooperation, could create a network of protection across the region. Shadow's alert posture caught James's attention. The dog had spotted movement at the property line. It turned out to be just local ranchers arriving to help with repairs, but the incident showed how the community was already coming together. "We'll need to train people," James told Sarah, "not just in security measures, but in recognizing threats and sharing information. The cartels rely on isolation and fear. We break that by building connections." Sarah nodded, making notes. The task force would incorporate these elements, creating a model that could be applied in other regions facing similar threats. As the day progressed, more neighbors arrived with supplies and offers of help. The double cross was becoming a symbol of resistance and resilience. Its battle scars, a reminder of what could be accomplished when people stood together. James watched the activity from the porch, where he had first confronted Mendoza days ago. The ranch would recover stronger than before. The cartel had tried to take advantage of what they perceived as weakness: a remote property, an elderly couple, a seemingly simple ranch hand. Instead, they had encountered strength they never expected: the dedication of a former federal agent, the resilience of a ranching family, and the unity of a community that refused to be victimized. The sun began to set over the New Mexico hills, painting the sky in familiar golds and purples. James felt Shadow lean against his leg, the dog ever vigilant despite the peaceful scene. Some things had changed: his quiet retirement, his anonymity, the ranch's peaceful routine. But other things remained constant: his commitment to protecting what mattered, the skills that had served him through decades of service, and now the bonds he had formed with the people and the land he had chosen to defend. The double cross would rebuild, its story becoming part of local legend, but more importantly, it would stand as a testament to the power of courage, community, and the unexpected strength that emerges when good people refuse to back down in the face of evil. 1 month after the battle at Double Cross Ranch, the transformation of the property and the surrounding community was remarkable. The barn had been rebuilt stronger than before, its new walls incorporating subtle security features that blended seamlessly with the traditional ranch architecture. Fields once scarred by combat now showed signs of recovery, though watchful eyes could still trace the events of that fateful night. James stood in the morning sun, supervising as contractors installed the last of the security cameras. The system was state-of-the-art, but discreet, part of a larger network that now connected ranches across the region. Shadow patrolled nearby, the dog's presence a constant reminder of the vigilance that had saved the ranch. Maria Martinez emerged from the main house, carrying coffee for the workers. Her initial wariness after returning home had been replaced by a quiet confidence, strengthened by the knowledge that their community stood united against future threats. The Thompson family called this morning, she told James, her voice carrying fresh purpose. Their ranch was approached by some investors yesterday, just like before. James nodded, already reaching for his phone. As a consultant for the FBI task force, he had helped establish protocols for handling potential cartel activity. The investors would be tracked, their connections mapped, adding another piece to the puzzle of criminal organizations attempting to infiltrate the region. Sarah. Collins arrived in an unmarked FBI vehicle, bringing updates from the ongoing investigation. The evidence gathered during the battle had led to multiple arrests and the seizure of cartel assets across 3 states. Mendoza's cooperation had proven invaluable, his detailed testimony exposing networks that had operated in shadows for years. Lossie. Diablos is still reeling, Sarah reported, spreading photos across the hood of her car. Their leadership is fractured, fighting over who to blame for the failure here. Our sources say they've abandoned plans for expansion in this region entirely. The victory had ripple effects beyond New Mexico. Other criminal organizations had taken notice of the failed operation, reassessing their strategies for moving into rural territories. The myth of easy targets and isolated victims had been shattered. Sheriff Bradley's deputy pulled up in a patrol car, bringing word from the latest community meeting. The local ranchers had formalized their communication network, creating a system for sharing information about suspicious activities and potential threats. It's like night and day, the deputy commented, accepting coffee from Maria. A few months ago, everyone was too scared to talk about these problems. Now they're organizing patrols, sharing resources, looking out for each other. James reviewed the security logs from the past week. The new systems had already identified and deterred several surveillance attempts, though none had been directly linked to cartel activities. The word was out. The Double Cross and its neighbors were no longer easy targets. Eduardo Martinez walked the repaired fence line with contractors, discussing additional improvements. The ranch's infrastructure was being upgraded systematically, incorporating security features while maintaining its working character. Federal grants, arranged through Sarah's connections, helped cover the costs. The young Roberts boy wants to apprentice here, Eduardo mentioned as James joined him. Says he wants to learn ranching and security. He's not the only one. We've had several requests from families wanting to place their children with us. The Double Cross was becoming more than just a ranch. It was evolving into a model for rural security and community resistance to criminal infiltration. James found himself conducting informal training sessions, teaching local residents to recognize and report suspicious activities. Sarah's phone buzzed with updates from the FBI's analysis unit. The intelligence gathered during the battle continued to yield results, exposing cartel operations far beyond New Mexico. Each new discovery validated James's decision to install comprehensive surveillance before the confrontation. We're implementing similar programs in other regions, Sarah explained, showing him reports from agricultural communities facing similar threats. Your experience here is helping create a template for rural defense against organized crime. The satellite phone James had used during the battle now served as part of the region's emergency communication network. Regular checks ensured that every connected ranch could raise the alarm if needed, preventing the isolation that had made them vulnerable. Shadow's alert bark drew attention to approaching vehicles, a convoy of trucks carrying materials for the next phase of improvements. The dog's training had been incorporated into the ranch's security protocols, with other families now seeking similar working dogs for their properties. The cartels relied on fear and isolation, James explained to a group of visiting ranchers. They expected to find scattered, vulnerable targets. Instead, they found a community ready to stand together. That's what really defeated them. Not just one night of battle, but the unity that followed. Maria organized lunch for the workers, the kitchen becoming an informal meeting space where information and support flowed freely. The Martinez family had emerged from the crisis stronger, their role in the community enhanced by their stand against intimidation. "We're getting inquiries from other states," Sarah mentioned during the meal. "Law enforcement agencies wanting to know how we transformed a potential disaster into a model for rural security. Your consultant status might need to expand." James considered the implications. His quiet retirement had evolved into something more meaningful, a chance to protect not just one ranch, but to help others defend themselves against organized crime. Eduardo joined them, spreading plans for new cattle pens across the table. The ranch's regular operations continued alongside security improvements, maintaining the balance between safety and productivity that James had always emphasized. "The younger generation sees it differently now," Eduardo observed. "They're not just inheriting farms and ranches. They're inheriting responsibility for protecting their communities. Your example showed them it's possible." Shadow's posture suddenly changed, alerting them to movement near the property line. It proved to be legitimate. More neighbors arriving to help with repairs, but the dog's vigilance demonstrated how security awareness had become ingrained in daily life. The afternoon brought more visitors, federal agents studying the ranches, defensive modifications, local law enforcement coordinating patrol strategies, and ranchers seeking advice on protecting their own properties. The Double Cross had become a learning center for rural security. Mendoza's trial starts next month, Sarah informed James quietly. His testimony is expected to expose cartel operations across the entire Southwest. None of that would have happened without your stand here. The mention of Mendoza brought back intense memories of the battle, but James focused on the positive outcomes. The cartel enforcers' capture had weakened criminal networks far beyond New Mexico, creating opportunities for other communities to resist infiltration. As evening approached, James walked the property with Shadow, checking security systems and observing the day's progress. The ranch bore subtle signs of its transformation: reinforced gates disguised as traditional entrances, surveillance equipment hidden in agricultural fixtures, emergency response protocols integrated into regular operations. Maria called everyone in for dinner, the kitchen table now accommodating an extended family of workers, agents, and neighbors. The bonds forged during the crisis had created new traditions, strengthening the community's resolve against future threats. "We're not just protecting land anymore," Eduardo reflected as they ate. "We're protecting a way of life, showing others they don't have to submit to criminals and thugs. That's worth more than any ranch." James nodded, understanding the truth. In the old rancher's words, the battle at Double Cross had been about more than property. It had become a symbol of resistance, a model for communities standing against organized crime. The sun set over the New Mexico hills, painting the sky in familiar colors. The ranch settled into its evening routine, security systems active but unobtrusive, Shadow alert but relaxed. The peace they had fought for felt more genuine now, built on strength and unity rather than isolation and hope. The story of Double Cross Ranch became more than just a tale of one man's stand against a cartel. It became a symbol of hope, showing how expertise, courage, and community could triumph over intimidation and violence. James Cooper had come to the ranch seeking peace, but found a greater purpose, protecting not just a piece of land, but a way of life worth defending. Today, the Double Cross Ranch stands as a testament to resilience, its battle scars transformed into badges of honor. James continues his work, balancing ranch duties with his role as security consultant, while Shadow remains ever vigilant at his side. The Martinez family's legacy is secure, strengthened by the bonds forged in adversity. And for those who might think this story sounds too incredible to be true, remember that sometimes the most extraordinary tales emerge from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a simple ranch hand truly can be so much more. If you enjoyed this incredible story of courage, tactical brilliance, and standing up against overwhelming odds, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You'll get notifications about more amazing true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when faced with impossible situations. Don't forget to like and share this video with others who appreciate tales of justice and determination. This is just one of many incredible stories we bring to you. Want to see more? Hit that notification bell to never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and remember, you never know who might be standing next to you, ready to make a difference when it matters most.